to celebrate the life of Charles D. LaFollette and to offer thanks to his contributions to the college with a lecture, the 35th Annual LaFollette Lecture. Before last year's speaker introduces this year's speaker, which is our custom, I'd like to say a few words about Charles LaFollette, or Leif as he is affectionately known by his friends, was known. Leif was raised in Thorntown, a community just 20 miles up the road. I'm not exactly sure how Thorntown got its name, but I have to assume it was a prickly place to begin with. But contrary to the name of his birthplace, Leif was known for acts of kindness and generosity. In 1920, with his Wabash diploma in hand, Leif traveled east to earn his MBA degree from Harvard. He was then asked to serve as the assistant dean of the Harvard Business School. For a period of time, he was drawn closer to home to work in publishing at Bobbs-Merrill in Indianapolis, but later he returned east to Corning, New York, where he completed a distinguished career as the financial vice president and director of the Corning Glass Company. He served as director emeritus of the Dow Corning Corporation, a trustee of the Corning Works Foundation, and the Corning Museum of Glass, a place where art and enterprise meet. As a resourceful, successful businessman, liberally educated, Leif studied and admired the writings, essays, and poetry of Samuel Johnson, and in doing so, I imagine that he pondered and took to heart these words composed by the writer: "Getting money is not all a man's business. To cultivate kindness is a valuable part of the business of life." As a Wabash student, he was managing editor of The Bachelor, a member of the Glee Club, and leader of the Wabash Players, the forerunners of the Scarlet Mass Theater Group. In 1952, Leif became a trustee at Wabash and served as a loyal alumnus for 25 years. Mr. LaFollette's loyalty was passed down to his son, Gary, who attended 33 of the previous 34 lectures. And so it is with much regret that Gary and Sue, his spouse, are unable to attend this afternoon. He will assuredly receive a DVD of the lecture, so please join me at this time to thank Gary and the LaFollette family with a hearty applause. Following Leif's active service on the Board of Trustees, the LaFollette Lectureship was established as an annual event. The lecturer is invited to address the relation of his or her academic discipline to the humanities, broadly conceived. You are invited to a reception in the Littell lobby following the lecture, but now to introduce this year's lecturer is last year's lecturer, Dr. Todd McDormand. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce this year's LaFollette Lecturer, Dr. Agata Szczeszak-Brewer, Associate Professor, Department Chair for English, a world citizen whose life experiences have influenced her choice of profession, shaped her work as a scholar, are translated into her approach as a teacher, and are reflected in the advocacy of her service. From Poland, Agata grew up in a family of teachers, journalists, and artists. Her mother, an English teacher, a profession not without risk in then communist Poland, exposed Agata to classic literary text at an early age. The entire family, 3 generations living together, including Agata's grandparents, were dedicated readers. Agata's love for books came from this environment, and from her mother in particular, who taught her to be a careful reader, a skeptical reader. Educated in her early years in a communist nation, this was an essential skill, as Agata learned to discern differences in meaning between the controlled history she learned in school and what she derived from literature and at home. Foreshadowing her future calling as a scholar and a teacher, she learned to read attentively and to question. Unsurprisingly, at college, Agata found herself drawn to English literature, completing a BA at the University of Varmia, Missouri, and an MA at the University of Wrocław. Based on her love of literature and desire to travel, Agata applied for a Rotary Foundation scholarship. As part of the scholarship process, she identified 5 countries in which she would be interested in serving as a Rotary International Ambassador. The United States made the list, barely. And of course, the United States was her placement, South Carolina, to be specific. As part of her responsibilities, and I can only imagine that there are some interesting stories here, Agata traveled to various locations in South Carolina to share about Polish culture. While at the University of South Carolina, she met her future husband, Josh, who enrolled as a graduate student there the same year. They met while in line for coffee and bagels, and the talk quickly turned to Polish poetry. Josh describes Agata as an immediate star, as the smartest person in the program. As these things sometimes happen, a planned 2-year stay in the United States turned into 4 years, followed by a tenure-track job offer in Crawfordsville, Indiana. More than 12 years later, there is a family, a home, a career. That career is one of a highly accomplished scholar drawn to challenging subject matter and offering analyses of modernism, religion, colonialism, race, and gender that other scholars have praised for its originality, clarity, and grace. In selecting James Joyce as one of her predominant points of focus, Agata has selected a writer who has mesmerized and intimidated readers, students and professors alike. Drawn to Joyce when she had her own questions about belonging, attracted to Joyce's rejection of controlling social doctrines, his work sparked an interest that has persisted in her scholarly endeavors. Those endeavors include the book Empire and Pilgrimage in Conrad and Joyce from the University of Florida Press, and the forthcoming book, Critical Approaches to Joseph Conrad, journal articles on Conrad and Joyce, frequent presentations at the International James Joyce Symposium and the International Meeting of the American Conference for Irish Studies, and travel across the globe, sharing her scholarship in Ireland, Poland, the Czech Republic, Canada, France, Mexico, Hungary, England, and more. In recognition of her work, Agata has been awarded the Bruce Harkness Young Conrad Scholar Award, has been recognized as a Fellow of the Conrad Society, serves as an advisory editor to the James Joyce Quarterly, and has previously served as a trustee for the Joseph Conrad Society of America. Colleagues describe Professor Szczeszak-Brewer as possessing deep humility, being the picture of collegiality, an incredibly hard worker, and meticulous in her teaching preparation. At the center of her work as a teacher is the care she has for her students to succeed. In her teaching, she has brought a global perspective to the English department and to Wabash College, with her attention to post-colonial studies and world literature, and her immersion learning experiences in Ireland. Agata brings an invaluable perspective to students and colleagues because not only is she an expert in the material, but her teaching is authentic, filled with personal experiences that she brings to the text. The result is, as one student put it, courses that disturb, that make students uncomfortable. It is an inspiring approach, the student says, explaining, quote, "It is one thing to teach men to love reading books. It is quite another to teach men the use of reading books and why it is vital to study them critically. Dr. Brewer urges the first to bring the second to life," end quote. With the strength of her convictions, Agata has posed difficult questions to us all about gender, race, culture, and class. She has been a voice for the betterment of Wabash with her leadership of the Gender Issues Committee, her role in the creation of the Bankart Gender Studies Speaker Series, as a proponent for examining questions related to parental leave and daycare, as a supporter of female faculty, and in her dedication to educating young men about gender. Of course, there is more to Agata than Wabash. She is deeply committed to her family, quite talented in classical guitar, and her interests include photography and gardening. While gardening was once essential to family sustenance as she grew up, now is an experience to share with her son Kuba and a way to forge multi-generational familial bonds and cultivating crops of her youth, such as fava beans, alpine strawberries, and red currants. It is representative of the way she carries her life experiences with her. Please join me in welcoming the 35th LaFollette Lecture, Professor Agata Szczeszak-Brewer, for her talk, Itinerant Humanities, Learning from James Joyce's Voluntary Exile. Immediately following the lecture, there will be a reception in the lobby to which all are invited. Dr. Agata Szczeszak-Brewer.
Thank you, Todd, for this very generous introduction. I also want to thank Julia Rosenberg, Adriel Trott, and Josh Brewer for reading drafts of this talk and for encouraging me. And this is a great, great honor for me to be able to speak to you today. Departures are stressful affairs. In 1904, an Irish modernist writer, James Joyce, there it is. In 1904, James Joyce, an Irish modernist writer, and Nora Barnacle, his girlfriend, embarked on a ferry that would take this unmarried couple on a lifelong pilgrimage through Europe. They had just met a few months before, she, a hotel maid from Galway, he, a Jesuit-educated young man with poor eyesight and an ambition to become a famous writer. Joyce must have known he'd never come back home for good. He didn't deceive Nora when he predicted in one of his letters the discomfort of their upcoming elopement and their life in exile. In the letter, he thanked her for choosing to stand beside me in this way in my hazardous life. In another letter, he confessed that he could not enter the social order except as a vagabond. Departures are stressful affairs when we're not quite sure where it is we're heading. But I dare say they are even more taxing when travelers have none of James Joyce's genius and self-confidence. 12 years ago, on a steamy August day, I sat in an air-conditioned Boeing at the Warsaw Chopin Airport, waiting for my migration west to begin. Until then, I was too scared to fly. When I traveled to other countries, I took a bus or a train. But there was no train that could take me to North America from the Lake District in northeastern Poland, where I lived for over 2 decades until I came to South Carolina. What did I learn when the plane finally took off and carried me rather turbulently over the Atlantic Ocean? I learned that I, indeed, hated flying. Up in the air, the connection between my muscles and my brain seemed severed. When the flight attendant held a plastic cup with a fizzy drink right in front of my face, I could not extend my arm to grab it. I do not recall talking to anyone or watching an in-flight entertainment program. I do recall a peculiar sensation in my guts as if someone grabbed my intestines and squeezed them tight. And when I landed safely in Columbia, South Carolina, and opened the door to my new apartment to discover a flying, hissing cockroach the size of my fist, I questioned my decision to leave the comfort of home. I promised myself that in 2 years, when I was supposed to return to Poland, I would go on a cargo ship instead of a plane. But only 4 months later, I found myself on a plane again, paralyzed with fear again, questioning my judgment when I flew to a conference in London, then to Mexico City, then to Montreal, and always back home to Poland, however briefly, to see my family and devour cabbage and dough. Perhaps this is why, as I began my doctoral studies in literature, I decided to focus on two itinerant writers, two voluntary exiles, James Joyce and Joseph Conrad. Perhaps this is why I was also attracted to other vagabond authors like Catherine Mansfield, Zoe Wickham, Evan Boland, J.M. Coetzee, Salman Rushdie. I found the nomadic lives of these authors and their characters appealing. They leave home, disillusioned by the constraints of their native cultures, propelled by the desire to encounter the new and to grow. They always remember where they came from, and their writing is suffused with their native cultures. But they keep on moving, propelled by the desire to encounter the new and to leave the familiar constraints of home behind. And in the midst of the debate about the so-called crisis of the humanities, I want my entire academic field to draw inspiration from authors like Joyce, Mansfield, or Rushdie. Without dismissing the very real financial crisis in humanities departments, especially those at public institutions, I want to address another kind of crisis, not entirely unrelated to funding, the crisis of identity of the entire field. But I will talk about James Joyce first, and you will eventually see that his life and writing can give us some direction to re-envision the humanities as a field. A sense of personal crisis and disillusionment compelled young Joyce and many other expat modernists away from his home country. He was born and educated in Ireland. He rejected formalized religion and the insular culture of turn-of-the-century Dublin, yet he remained saturated with both religion and Dublin, and he explored them in his writing until he died. Joyce's personal pilgrimage through Dublin, Paris, Trieste, Pola, Rome, and Zurich influenced his portrayal of Leopold Bloom's and Stephen Daedalus's restlessness. So did his disenchantment with Dublin's factionalism and with what he perceived to be the stifling limitations imposed by the Catholic Church, by England, and by his destitute and rowdy father. In a country whose citizens were either Catholic or Protestant, pro-union or anti-union, pro-treaty or anti-treaty, pro-Parnell or anti-Parnell, there seemed to be no niche for those who acknowledged plurality and diversity. Who chose to explore their identities rather than blindly follow ideologies, who realized that succumbing to limitations imposed by society and politics equaled spiritual and artistic death. Joyce's personal and aesthetic rebellion becomes clear when he openly admits to his inability to create freely amid the restraints of his country. He refers to his itinerant life as a voluntary exile. In A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Joyce's alter ego, Stephen Daedalus, says, "I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself my home, my fatherland, or my church, and I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning." Stephen's and Joyce's self-exile to distant nations is the first step to fulfilling his pledge to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. The arrogance and danger of such desires are suggested in a fiery sermon in a portrait, when Father Arnauld tells the schoolboys about Lucifer and his sin of pride, the sinful thought conceived in an instant, non serviam, I will not serve. Father Arnauld warns the boys that this moment was Lucifer's ruin. Stephen will repeat the words of Lucifer several times in the portrait and Ulysses, and he will insist that this denial is the requisite step towards self-knowledge and freedom indispensable in the process of creation. Exile furnished Joyce, Stephen's creator, with a sense of dejection and ostracism. These, in turn, provided inspiration and necessary distance from the familiar, a detachment which many creative writers consider invaluable in the process of capturing the complexities of fictional settings. Czesław Miłosz once remarked that an immigrant will often, for motives of self-defense, cut himself off completely from his land of origin and show toward it a friendly condescension, thereby contrasting his own success to the miseries of those left behind in the old country. But in his letter to Lady Gregory, Joyce confesses that, although I have been driven out of my country here as a misbeliever, I have found no man yet with a faith like mine. Joyce was Ireland's most fierce critic and the most loyal follower. The Irish don't easily forget rejection and condescension, though. Joyce's statue in Dublin is, after all, universally called a prick with a stick. But Joyce wrote about his homeland with a great deal of warmth, not just criticism. In his fiction, he goes back to Dublin streets again and again, and he goes back to the west of Ireland where his beloved Nora came from, most memorably in the ending of his story, The Dead. The last paragraph of the story is the most touching and beautiful description of a native land by a self-exiled writer. I'll read that paragraph now. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead. James Joyce, a voluntary exile, a wanderer, a seeker, always came home. He famously borrowed the quest motif from the ancient myth of Odysseus, and his homage to Homer's Odyssey in his own monumental novel Ulysses is yet another way in which the writer comes home. This master of experimental writing and irreverent violator of tradition returns home whenever he alludes to Odysseus' wandering and whenever he lets us encounter his Irish equivalent of Odysseus, Leopold Bloom, an Irishman, a Jew, and a cuckold, a homeless and alienated character, an ancient mariner. Tradition gives Joyce a platform upon which he builds a story of a modern-day wanderer, one who suffers abuse from the likes of the aggressive and jingoistic citizen and his companions. But Joyce departs from tradition in ways that infuriated his contemporaries, provoking some countries, including this one, to ban Ulysses on the grounds of obscenity. Even Virginia Woolf, an experimental writer herself, said that reading Ulysses amused, stimulated, charmed her at first, but then she was puzzled, bored, irritated, and disillusioned as by a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples. Indeed, as we plow through the book, we read about Stephen Daedalus's snot, Leopold Bloom's erections and bowel movements, and Molly Bloom's menstruation, and we're not quite sure where we're heading, especially when we realize that each chapter assumes a different narrative style. And yet, in all this apparent directionlessness, we learn a great deal about suffering, betrayal, desire, and compassion. We know the characters intimately, and we want to reach out and touch them, talk to them, cry with them, walk with them. In the Odyssey, when Penelope's suitors see Odysseus in disguise and abuse him, they call him Plankte, someone wandering, implying that he does not belong to the place, but also that he is wandering in mind, distraught. Joyce explores Leopold Bloom's wandering mind and his position as a stranger in Dublin. Bloom is ostracized by Dubliners because of his Jewish origin, gentle nature, and inability to participate in a low-key, irreverent pub banter with its puns, shallow witticisms, and profanities. He is estranged from his wife and distant from other Jews, since he does not observe their traditions. But he keeps traveling through the city despite impediments, mostly on foot, and he responds to the violence of narrow-minded, binge-drinking Dubliners by proposing that the answer to force, hatred, history, all that, is love. Exile and nomadism, those unsettling symptoms of modernist physical and spiritual displacement, can furnish us with love. Love for discovery, love for learning, love for the other. It is through leaving the comfort of home and encountering alien worlds, people, and ideas that the humanities classroom thrives. We expect our students to enter the world of the unknown with courage, but we are hesitant to do it ourselves. We should have the courage to face the new collectively as a discipline, despite the potential dangers. Another modernist writer, E.M. Forster, gives us an example of a perilous stroll into the unknown. In The Machine Stops, Forster's early 20th century dystopian tale about a human race living underground in an elaborate computer-regulated machine allowing people contact with each other via a Skype-like communication system, the main character, Kuno, decides to break out and travel to the surface of the earth. He is aware of the danger. If indeed one dies immediately in the outer air, as the accepted wisdom has it, his life will be in danger. If he gets out and lives, he faces punishment from the central committee running the machine. In the machine, people rarely travel, and they are seized by the horror of direct experience. The committee's punishment for insubordination is homelessness, which is believed to be death. The victim is exposed to the air, which kills him. When Kuno tells his mother, who worships the machine, that he has been going outside without permits or respirators, her response is simple. "You are throwing civilization away," she says. She decides her son is reverting to some savage type, Crawling out on the surface of the earth to seek direct experience was, after all, deemed foolish, vulgar, and perhaps faintly improper. It was unproductive of ideas and had no connection with the habits that really mattered. And though this modernist science fiction story is an indictment of people's increasing reliance on technology, it is also a warning against our acceptance of the status quo, our tendency to follow ideologies and traditions unquestioningly, and our fear of the unknown that limits experience and dulls empathy. Let's look at the crisis of the humanities as an opportunity to re-envision the field, to send it off on a great adventure away from home. Let's remember and talk about the origin of the humanities, the roots, but let's not treat the humanities as a field with a calcified identity, unchanging and entrenched in the past. Lest you misunderstand me. This is not a call to forget about the past, to abandon Confucius and Aristotle, Beowulf and Dante, Voltaire and Tolstoy. Mine is a call to open ourselves up to new ways of teaching them, and new ways of assuring our students and decision makers in academia that the humanities are and always have been relevant. I want the humanities to remember home, but to be comfortable with change, to embrace new opportunities, to feel the excitement of moving forward, and to let their identity be molded by that movement, not to be threatened by changing or porous boundaries. If we do not initiate new adventures, and if we do not embrace an itinerant mode of exploration as potentially educational and formative, we will be forced to change anyway. And the difference between voluntary exile and being forced into a refugee status is profound. Joyce, for example, was never barred from returning to Dublin. He maintained his ties with Ireland, and if he chose to, he could always return home through his experimental fiction and political essays, or by visiting Ireland himself. Refugees facing real violence have no luxury of returning home. As Adam Zagajewski wrote in one of his poems, refugees forced out of their homes by violence trudge through snow as if leaning toward another, better planet with less ambitious generals, less snow, less wind, fewer cannons, less history. Alas, there is no such planet, just that hunch. Shuffling their feet, they move slowly, very slowly, toward the country of nowhere and the city of no one on the river of never. Underfunded and disrespected humanities are the refugees of academia. In the last decade alone, whole departments have fallen victim to the corporate takeover of learning. Others are bracing themselves for war right now. So without dismissing the value of staying home, I want to suggest that we explore new ways of thinking about home, and that we travel to other disciplines, yes, including computer science and STEM, to enrich our thinking about home. J.K. Chesterton and others before him knew that the whole object of travel is not to set foot on foreign land. It is at last to set foot in one's own country as a foreign land. Being homesick without being homeless, looking back at one's roots from a distance, conversing with the past while imagining new beginnings, all this is potentially generative and exciting. The writers we study in the literature classroom and the teachers who assign their texts put home in conversation with the tradition in order to other it. These writers often speak with each other across the boundaries of time and space. They leave home to drop in on distant relatives or total strangers. Come to Bin's Testament of Mary responds to the New Testament and allows Mary to voice her dismay over the idol worship surrounding her son and eventually her anguish over his death. A.C. Clarke revisits the narrative of the devil among us in his science fiction novel Childhood's End. A number of Irish and Irish American writers talk with or back to James Joyce's Dubliners. Joyce himself converses with Homer, with Irish nationalists, and with Vico. American novelist Michael Cunningham enters a dialogue with Virginia Woolf. Carol Ann Duffy revisits Greek and Roman mythologies to give voice to the women rendered mute by the original storytellers. This is the essence of the humanities, embracing the nomadic state of not knowing and not belonging, and at the same time living in the text and conversing with it freely, being rooted in tradition and challenging it, respecting the canon and revisiting it as we begin to understand who created it in the first place and who was silenced, retaining our reverence for the printed book and letting ourselves feel excited about the new modes of writing, publishing, and discussing literature. The humanities would be greatly impoverished without the so-called dead white men, but they would be equally impoverished without scholars, philosophers, and writers who challenge them. Our disciplines are grounded in printed text or painted canvas, but they should also explore the new technologies that democratize people's access to knowledge and allow the difficult conversation with tradition to happen instead of hiding behind a paywall. We should use these technologies with excitement and criticize them where they fail to deliver. In the nomadic future of the humanities, scholars of sub-Saharan literature collaborate freely with visual artists and computer science experts on projects that would attract students and the general public. In the nomadic future of the humanities, business owners, nurses, and local artists join college students in poetry slams and book clubs. Our brilliant philosophers of gender, race, and class leave the campus regularly to engage middle schoolers and high schoolers in the life of the mind, leading discussions about the issues that affect them. In the nomadic future of the humanities, we prove that literature is not only for the elite few, that the beauty of the written and spoken word can move everyone, and everyone can try to articulate why. To accomplish all this, the humanities will have to open up and venture out without the fear that we're undermining some primeval principle of what it is we should be doing as scholars and teachers. Pretentious, intentionally obscure, and insular humanities will soon face decline. I do not dismiss the beauty and importance of navigating the world of ideas without any stated utilitarian purpose. But the humanities should be in flux, inviting others to join in their nomadism, open to other disciplines, learning from them, and teaching them too. One avenue we shouldn't be afraid to explore is the subfield of digital humanities. Scholars have been digitizing ancient and otherwise inaccessible texts for over 2 decades now. They have been developing software and applications that allow for in-depth exploration of difficult writing. They have been turning notoriously difficult books, such as James Joyce's Ulysses, into video games to draw a wider audience to the narrative. They have been publishing hyperlinked online editions of novels and poems, offering easy access to expert annotations, available with a click of the mouse. And yet, almost every week, I come across an essay or a blog bemoaning the loss of depth in digital reading, the supposed betrayal of the field, the magic of the printed text sold out for the cheap thrill of clicking on a button and instant satisfaction. While I'm not positing that digital humanities is the only way to venture out and discover the new, I want to validate the work of those literature, classics, and philosophy scholars who learn to code and labor on new projects in the digital realm. Mine is not a call to abolish libraries and immerse ourselves in the virtual world. As some of you know, I have been defending the fundamental connection between seemingly aimless browsing or spine reading and intellectual discovery. Both technologies, printed books and computers, are complementary and important to our field. In a recent Chronicle of Higher Education article, Naomi Barron bemoans the ways in which the digital world has encroached on the humanities. This world, according to her, is reducing students' pursuit of work in the humanities. She writes that academics are buying into the transition with little thought for educational consequences. As an owner of an e-book reader, and more real books than my house can accommodate, as a teacher who cherishes face-to-face seminar-style discussions and who experiments with using social media and technology in the classroom, I want to say that these different modes need not be in a constant battle. The phrase digital humanities is not an oxymoron. Our classrooms can be spaces where the students engage in in-depth reading of a printed text and learn how to approach an electronic text with the same care and scrutiny as the book. The nomad in me says, explore all kinds of charted and uncharted written words, discover their dangers and potentials, learn how to approach hyperlinked Paradise Lost on the screen with the same depth you'd give it if there were a printed book on your lap. Who knows, maybe we will see a generation of students who would otherwise toss aside a difficult book, I'm looking at you, Finnegan's Wake, but who, with the help of hyperlinked information, glossaries available with one click of a mouse or tap of a finger, maps, dates, and online conversations, could become lifelong readers and learners. True, studies show that students reading on the screen retain less than those reading print, partly because writing notes by hand aids retention of material much more than typing notes on a computer. But we are teaching digital natives. Will they abandon their iPads and laptops? I doubt it. Let's teach them then how to use the tools they have at hand effectively. Let's discuss openly what's lost when they pick up a Kindle edition of Walt Whitman's poems. Let's experiment with both mediums. Let's give our students the kind of skills they will need to navigate all kinds of texts, most of them digital, once they graduate from college. Over a decade ago, Tom Campbell spoke to you here as a medievalist interested in the latest technological advances. In his LaFollette Lecture, The Virtual Manuscript, he said that by merging the two technologies, the codex and the computer, he could make you see that medieval manuscript he studied in Europe. Many of you remember how excited he was to try out new technologies in the classroom and in his research. Tom proved time and again that a humanities professor's commitment to technology and sometimes risky explorations of the new can go hand in hand with a kind of careful analysis of literary tradition that Wabash has cherished for almost 2 centuries. The humanities can democratize access to the most obscure, coveted, unique, and special texts that only the most privileged used to have access to. The comments we hear nowadays from politicians and other public figures that the humanities are a luxury few can afford do a lot of damage, not just to the field, but to our students as well. People who say this tend to work under several assumptions. That careful reading and a deep engagement with the world of ideas are extraneous to education, that there is nothing practical or relevant in letting our minds wander, and that students should not be nomads, that roaming through the messy and obscure world of ideas does not and will not lead to their definition of success. I want to challenge this notion today. It is harmful and presumptuous to tell 18-year-old students first what success is or should be for them, and second, how exactly to achieve it. If we do so, we define their identities for them, build walls around this definition, lest the distraction of the humanities creeps in, and deny them the kind of growth and maturation that comes from doubting, questioning, struggling, fumbling for words, and, yes, feeling uncomfortable. We give the students one answer and bar them from all the other possibilities of their becoming. As Kristen Case put it, to say that women's studies or philosophy or French is a waste of time for students who need more practical training is to tell those students we already know who and what they are. It is to kill their other chances. Like James Joyce and other modernists who left home in both literal and metaphorical ways when they abandoned the comfort of established modalities of expression, the humanities, as well as their teachers and students, should be encouraged to leave home and redefine themselves as they cross borders and encounter an alien world. If the humanities could repeat Stephen Daedalus's call, away, away, with equal enthusiasm but with less arrogance, perhaps we wouldn't be talking about their crisis. If we acknowledge the importance of the formative origins of the field and continue exploring them unapologetically and with passion, but in a way that would be inclusive of those unfamiliar with the prohibitive jargon of most academic papers, we could capture the interest in ancient philosophy, medieval morality plays, or postmodern theater among people who are not affiliated with academia, but who enjoy the life of the mind. We could avoid the charge of being locked up in the ivory tower, waiting for our slow death as the masses outside rage against us. If we admit that revamping and energizing the field will take resources and a tremendous amount of creativity and courage, and if we reward the courage to leave home in search of discovery, the humanities classrooms will always be filled with students. Let me be clear. I am not advocating for replacing real books and real face-to-face challenging, often messy discussions of literature or philosophy with 21st century technology. Nor am I advocating for crafting the humanities classrooms as purely utilitarian spaces, devoid of a sense of wonder. The true value of liberal arts education lies in the intimacy of the classroom, not with corporate-driven electronic learning platforms. The true value of the humanities lies in searching and wondering. When my students in James Joyce's Ulysses course complained about the difficulty of the 15th chapter of the novel, written in the form of a play and filled with the characters' hallucinations, we took that class outside the English department and walked across Grand Street to the experimental theater in this building. Instead of sending my students to proliferating web links that elucidate James Joyce's Ulysses to first-time readers, I opted for a different and more time-consuming experience. Finally, the students had a reason to read that long Circe chapter closely and analyze the language. I asked them to stage it for others. So they got their parts, studied their characters in great detail, selected makeshift costumes and props, rehearsed, and invited the Wabash and DePaul communities to their performance. And the result was stunning. We moved from whining about incomprehensible Joyce, through complaints about the assigned parts. "Dr. Brewer, you gave me the role of a prostitute." And we arrived on stage, putting to use the long hours of struggling with the text and its meaning. The humanities open to other disciplines and to the world outside the classroom are alive, and they would be hard to dismiss as irrelevant. What I am not advocating is what some call the short-sighted techno-boosterism that they claim is rendering American culture increasingly superficial and frivolous. Before connecting the two technologies, the printed book and the World Wide Web, and before taking the humanities for a stroll outside the campus gates, it is essential to delve deep into the text we want to transform or elucidate. Digital humanities, focused only on the end, rather than the origin and the means, would indeed be the death of our discipline. But in a classroom filled with digital natives, exploring the intricacies, nuances, and ethical dimensions of the written word, with a goal to produce an interactive platform to share with others, might just give those students an incentive to take the time and understand literature. We're already doing a lot of great work here at Wabash. Adriel Trott is blogging about philosophy. Elizabeth Morton made a movie about a Nigerian sculptor, Lamidi Fakeye. Jill Lamberton is teaching a popular audio rhetoric class. The English department offers courses that take students abroad and allows them real immersion in the literary and cultural worlds they study. The rhetoric department started the civic engagement project that transforms theory of public engagement into practice in our own community. We send students to professional conferences, writers' workshops, and exhibitions. But it would take a more systemic shift to make all this possible on a larger scale. First, a lot of these creative ways of approaching the humanities are time-consuming and costly, and grants for the humanities scholars and teachers, always unimpressive, are becoming even more rare, as the National Endowment for the Humanities and Fulbright funds are being drastically cut. Second, we should start rewarding public engagement with the humanities in tangible ways. A series of compelling and clear blogs about an obscure 17th century poet should count toward tenure and promotion, together with required well-researched papers published in specialized peer-reviewed journals. Both forms of engagement with our subjects are important and valid, and they should be complementary as well as rewarded. Publishing in traditional academic journals tests new ideas on the forum of narrowly specialized scholars and adds new knowledge to the field. Explaining our research to the general public in clear, accessible prose could make it possible for us to continue testing those ideas in a narrowly specialized forum. If popularizing the humanities, the hard work of bringing them out in the open, is derided as a job of a traveling salesman, the humanities will lose public support, and along with it, the resources necessary to thrive. And finally, why, some of you may ask, are the humanities worth saving? In the recent death of the humanities debate, one argument is quite prevalent: that the humanities are out of touch with contemporary reality, with the demands of the job market, with the changing culture. I want to claim that the humanities have never been more in tune with reality. What's more relevant to contemporary issues than a narrative like Virginia Woolf's of a man suffering from what we now call PTSD and taking his own life? What's more relevant than E.M. Forster's century-old story of a mother who lost touch with friends and family because she relied entirely on what the screen in front of her told her to do and think? Than a fable about animals corrupted by power after their successful revolution? Than a play about one Caliban who, having been enslaved for a long time, says to his masters, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language." As we face the dire consequences of the divide and rule colonial oppression in Africa and the Middle East, how can reading and discussing Conrad's Heart of Darkness be pointless? As we watch the police shoot unarmed black men in the streets, can we learn something by analyzing the dehumanizing language of Conrad's Marlowe in Heart of Darkness? In Emerson's words, the use of literature is to afford us a platform whence we may command a view of our present life, a purchase by which we may move it. Talking about issues of political violence, injustice, betrayal, friendship, gender, poverty, racism, miscommunication between generations, war and peace, or our fragile ecosystem, all these complex topics embedded in literature of all ages can indeed equip our students with the tools necessary not only to thrive on the job market, but also to be compassionate and informed leaders. Kristen Case talks about moments of classroom grace in the humanities. There is, she says, difficulty, discomfort, even fear in such moments, which involve confrontations with what we thought we knew. These moments do not reflect a linear progress from ignorance to knowledge. Instead, they describe a step away from a complacent knowing into a new world in which, at least at first, everything is cloudy, nothing is quite clear. We do not aim to confuse in an English classroom. We do aim to complicate. We aim to reveal complex emotions in the sound of the snow falling softly on nocturnal Dublin. We aim to disturb easy assumptions and jingoistic narratives as we read about the atrocities of war. We aim to question why a middle-aged ad canvasser would acquiesce to his opera singer wife's infidelity. We aim to explore the complexities of human emotions and decisions beyond numbers and statistics. We aim to empathize. We aim to discover the beauty of language. In our search for discovery and our wandering, maps often come in handy. But Evan Boland, an Irish poet, has already told us that the science of cartography is limited because the line which says woodland and cries hunger and gives out among sweet pine and cypress and finds no horizon will not be there. Maps, so indispensable in our journeys, simplify reality, impose an established or symbolic order, and reduce historical and cultural significance to abstract spatial markers. The humanities provide a different kind of map writing. It's an exploration of hunger, betrayal, and joy that is not systematic but deeply human, that hopefully releases our ability to see human beings with all their imperfections and pain behind numbers and charts. We need the humanities to survive because experiencing the alien people, alien places, alien points of view, alien emotions, is the only way we can approximate understanding of suffering and loss, of anger and joy. If we want to teach our students how to live humanely, act responsibly, lead effectively, and think critically, despite discipline-specific knowledge will not be enough. Looking at human tragedy solely from the point of view of numbers and systematized data is limited. I want my students to search in those classroom discussions for a wellspring of empathy, so one day, when they hear about migrant children who faced unspeakable violence in their home countries, they know that beyond numbers and bottom-line cost analyses are suffering human beings. When they listen to two warring sides explain organized killing, they question what they hear and feel the pain of the parents whose children were bombed in their sleep. It is in the humanities classroom that young Wabash men can approach and try to understand the mind of a conscientious objector instead of condemning him on the spot as a coward. to empathize with a gay man dying of AIDS rather than dismiss him as immoral, to share the outrage of a woman turned away from a library because of her sex. Such empathy is not just a job skill, it's a life skill. Without embarking on a fictionalized journey through emotions, it is hard to see through the wall of the other. We may never know the other, but we should let the other speak to us. So let us together see the humanities, take a stroll into uncharted territories, but always remember home, like Leopold Bloom, who, after walking through Dublin for many hours, returns in a chapter called Ithaca to his unfaithful wife's bed and kisses the plump, mellow, yellow, smellow melons of her rump. Voluntary exile from Ithaca, from the Bloom's jingling bed, from Ireland, from the Lake District in Poland, from Aristotle and Shakespeare, from a printed book and a lecture hall, will help us look at home upon our return in a new way, influenced by encountering the alien. The humanities that boldly leave home and yet always remember home. The humanities that are not afraid to take a risky detour. The humanities that are not too aloof to leave the campus from time to time and engage pressing issues with clarity and empathy. This is a field that will survive any crisis of confidence. Thank you.